Hello, everybody. Welcome to Engines of Creation podcast. I'm your host, Cristian Mastrodonato. In this captivating episode, we delve into the intricacies of democratic innovation with Claudia Chwalisz, founder and CEO of Democracy Next. Claudia's organization is pioneering a global platform aimed at transforming governance by incorporating principles of sortition and deliberation, not just in government, but across various institutions like schools, universities, and workplaces. We discussed the importance of moving away from the oversimplification of complex issues, a prevalent problem in current democratic systems. She explains how creating deliberative spaces, such as citizen assemblies, allows for a deeper engagement with complexity. One of the key highlights is the role of face-to-face interactions in these deliberative processes. She argues that while technology can enhance these processes, it cannot replace the depth of in-person engagement. In discussing the evolution of democracy, Claudia touches on historical perspectives and the need for continuous experimentation and innovation in governance. In fact, societies have always experimented with different forms of governance, challenging the notion of a static, inevitable democratic system. We also touched on the concept of social acceleration, as theorized by Harmut Rosa. She believes that creating intentional spaces for deliberation can help address feelings of alienation and disconnection, ultimately leading to a more resonant and cohesive society. Join us for this enlightening conversation that challenges conventional views on democracy and offers a fresh perspective on how we can create a more inclusive and effective system of governance. So, let's go. Welcome, Claudia. I'm really excited for this conversation today. We have today here at Engines of Creation, Claudia Chwalisz, and I'm sure this conversation is going to be very fascinating. So can you start, please, to introduce yourself and tell us something about your organization?
Thank you, Christian. Really lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, I guess my name is Claudia Chwalisz. I'm the founder and CEO of Democracy Next, which is an organization that I run and I founded in 2022. So it's relatively new and recent still. And we're a global platform for democratic innovation, working to shift who has power and how we take decisions. So a lot of the work that we do is really focus on these kind of principles of sortition, meaning random selection of decision makers, and also deliberation, meaning collectively weighing evidence to come to shared decisions off the back of it. And we're working to bring these principles into the innovation of governance, both in government, but also in other kinds of institutions of daily life, like our schools and universities and workplaces, museums, financial institutions. So we're seeing more and more experimentation kind of in a broader way, which is opening up, I think, an imagination to rethinking even what democracy means, and that it's so much more than just elections as well. And so I've been working on these kind of questions around democratic innovation for quite a long time now, over 10 years, closer to 15 years now, in different guises.
I was really fascinated by the activities that you personally and your organization, Democracy Next, is doing. And I've been following you from quite some time. So I was really delighted when you accepted the invitation to join this podcast. So let's start actually from picking up some of the words you just said in introduction and something that really interested me, because you mentioned innovation, and innovation in democracy is something very interesting, which is not often talked about, I believe, enough, in the sense that we tend to take democracy as a static process. And we're going to dive down a little bit more about the time in the process maybe later. But the other topic that really fascinates me, and it's kind of one of the core topics of this podcast, is complexity. And the impression is that with this approach that you are proposing, we can sort of run away and move away from simplification, which is, I believe, and not only myself, I think many people believe that simplification is one of the biggest problems of democracy right now. We're trying to constantly simplify complex problems instead of actually having an honest approach and say, this is hard, and it needs different way to approach this sort of thing. So do you believe that actually the new approach you're bringing can be a way to avoid simplification, embrace complexity at democratic level?
Yeah, I think this is a really excellent question to start with. There's so much in there to unpick, but I think maybe zooming in on what you're saying at the very end to do with complexity in particular, I think, what you're saying is really head on as part of the problem that we have with our current systems of democracy, which try to simplify so much, whereas I believe that we really need to be creating in this more structural way spaces that enable people to really be with the complexity of the problems that we face, which also then entails having the time to be with that complexity, to learn about it, to hear from different perspectives, to grapple with it and be with that evidence. And in these deliberative spaces like citizens' assemblies, which I realize is a term that I haven't yet defined or talked about, but that's often the kind of umbrella term of the kinds of processes and bodies that I'm talking about. So citizens' assemblies or deliberative assemblies being these spaces where there's randomly selected groups of people that are convened to solve problems, but over a lengthy period of time, usually over multiple days, spread out over multiple months, working towards finding high levels of common ground on a shared set of propositions. And I think that all of these different design characteristics of these processes, I mean, first of all, it's quite far away from what is the standard way of how we're dealing with a lot of policy making and also other kinds of decision making in other organizations as well. But one of the key aspects of what such a design enables is the creation of the conditions that enable people to really be with complexity. And I think it's one of the key reasons why I'm so drawn to this area of work as well, because I think probably, I'm sure in other moments of history too, one could say that there have always been kind of complex problems and there's always been complexity. But I think there's nonetheless a compelling argument that says that in today's time, we live in a moment of particular complexity. And I think creating the spaces and the processes that enable us to be with that is really crucial.
In particular, I'm very attracted by this definition of deliberative spaces. And one of the things that I picked up in some of your articles and talks is also about the importance of face-to-face in these deliberative spaces, which I think is the other side of the coin. So we're trying to create a process that involves human beings. And if you want to be more efficient, we actually need to bring these human beings together. So try to understand a little bit more with you what's the role of the sort of face-to-face participation versus the adoption of technologies in the process, and how much technologies can help versus actually the old style sitting together for a certain amount of time is actually necessary, and we don't have any way around it. And probably there's nothing bad with that. It's nice to sit together with other people.
I'm glad you asked this because I feel there's a kind of general tendency to make this equation almost where like, oh, if we're going to talk about innovating democracy, that means like making it digital and therefore making it somehow more kind of quote unquote efficient by eliminating some of the time needed or some of the face-to-face or those things that actually require a lot of effort and work and so on. But I think if we take a step back and ask ourselves, well, like, what are the problems we're actually trying to solve with democracy? One of those problems to me really has to do with kind of the deeper root reasons of why we face such issues with democratic disillusionment and the kind of deeper disruptors that we see that have to do with people's sense of a lack of agency, a lack of voice, lack of feeling of belonging and sense of community and, loneliness and not really being part of something bigger than themselves. And then also therefore distrusting others and distrusting government and that distrust going in all directions. And so if we want to try and address those problems, I don't see how, having an online platform where you can like write in a one-word response to something is the solution to it. And so it's why I've been really a deep kind of advocate of needing to create spaces that bring diverse groups of people together for lengthy periods of time, and to do that face-to-face and in person, because I think we need to be able to start to kind of address a lot of those deeper issues that I was just referencing now. But also, let me share one story of an example of what I'm talking about, maybe, so this feels also less abstract, because it's linked to both that like more personal side of like strengthening people's sense of like trust and with each other and belonging and all of these things, but also how it ends up really enabling better decision making to happen on a complex issue. So, one of the most powerful stories that has stuck with me from the whole kind of world and examples of citizens' assemblies was from one of the first citizens' assemblies that took place in Ireland at the national level, which was around the issue of same-sex marriage, and whether the Irish constitution should be changed to allow this to be possible. And it was from this first group of people. So there were a group of people from Ireland who were randomly selected to be part of this, broadly representative of the Irish population. And they had numerous months to be able to deliberate about this and come up with a set of recommendations. And there's a really beautiful story about two of the assembly members, one who is named Chris, 26-year-old from Dublin, who arrived on the first day of this assembly with his nails painted and kind of wanting to really show and give everybody a sense of his identity as being a gay man, and that this was a process that really mattered to him in this very personal way. Actually, before this assembly process took place, he was even on the verge of wanting to move to Canada, because he felt that he was going to have no kind of future in a country that didn't really acknowledge the value of him being a gay man and being able to have a gay marriage potentially in the future, and so on. And on the first day he arrives and he sat randomly at a table with Finbar, who's a 50-ish-year-old truck driver from a really tiny village somewhere near Cork, who has been very openly homophobic his entire life. And both of them felt really quite nervous arriving on this first day of the assembly for various reasons. I mean, they were kind of both like, what am I doing here? And somehow, actually, because of their nervousness, they bonded over that first moment of talking to each other at the table they were randomly assigned to sit at. And over the course of the few months of this assembly process, they started going for pints in between the assembly meetings, going to the pub and having more informal chats. And they came to be really, really, really close friends. And by the end of the assembly process, in one of the last sessions, Finbar got up and told a story to the whole assembly, and he shared a story which he had never even told to his wife or his family or his kids or his parents or anybody else. The fact that his entire childhood, or a part of his childhood, he'd been molested by one of his parents' friends, and that this was the source of why for a long time he felt really homophobic, and for in his mind being gay was kind of equivalent to being a pedophile. And so anyways, I'm not obviously saying it in his words the way that he recounted it in a way, but I'm telling the story, but just to kind of convey the sense that I don't think any of what I just described would have happened if this had been an online process, if this had been a really short process. And so and I think it also conveys a lot of the complexity in this issue, which is not black and white in any sort of way. And so I think, kind of getting back to what was your original question with why I'm talking about this, but it was about the face-to-face. And I think, I hope the story kind of conveys why there's something that just is enabled when we create those opportunities for people to spend more time together with people who are really different from them and who they might not encounter in their lives otherwise. And the sort of randomness of the whole process brings them together.
Thanks for sharing this episode. And I think it's so helpful to tell this story and to listen to this story to understand the importance of sort of human being interaction. I think sometimes I say that as a person that spent most of his career in technology. I think technology science people, we tend to approach and think of innovation as sort of building new tech things, but here innovation is really about the way we work together, the way we live together, and we create a society which is a different thing. That doesn't mean technology cannot be an enabler, but we might argue that democracy is a technology itself. And actually, I've read a few places where this is argued, that technology is something that has been created by human beings to serve a purpose, to work together. And I think if we look at it from this perspective, it just doesn't need to be digital.
That point though, like that doesn't mean though that technology has no role in these processes either, actually. So some of the work that we're doing at Democracy Next is actually in collaboration with the MIT Center for Constructive Communication around tech-enhanced deliberative assemblies. And so we're thinking primarily about how we could be enhancing in-person deliberations, but then obviously there's a way of applying the kinds of things we're doing to other contexts where things are being done purely online, kind of on Zoom or other video conferencing things. And there's also sort of hybrid versions that are going on, all of which need sort of different design considerations. But anyway, it's a different philosophy and starting point, I think, to be thinking about how could we be using technology to enhance this in-person process rather than to replace or try and, make more efficient or so on. Because I think there is actually a big philosophical divide in the field right now of democratic innovation about what role technology plays. And there's people who, on the one hand, like us, are trying to work towards really putting forth like the in-person part, the fact that actually trust only, or you can only do things at the speed of trust, and therefore things need time, but also you need to do things in relatively small groups, but you can multiply the number of small groups you work with, versus another mindset which is about trying to create opportunities for having 1 million people deliberate with each other in one kind of mass deliberation. And for that to be possible, though, you end up cutting back on a lot of the other good quality design criteria, which is part of what makes the whole magic of a deliberation work in the first place. To me, there's no sort of magic shortcut to getting to the kinds of results of what I was just describing with the story with Chris and Finbar. You just cannot create the conditions for something like that to be possible in a shorter time span and in a purely online setting, I think.
It's a very important clarification. Thanks for sharing it. I completely get it. Even being a technology person, I always appreciated the human interaction. And personally, I actually suffered during the COVID when I couldn't go to the office. It's also important to meet other human beings. And I think it makes a difference from the point of view of the quality of the work. And especially when it comes to innovation, I think it's particularly important. You mentioned that there are different approaches and which are sort of trying to put technology at the forefront and bringing more people together. And scaling is a topic that I find interesting in that sense. We might discuss a little bit more about scaling. And what I would really like to understand, first of all, is you talked about two different philosophies. So do you think it's a kind of a dichotomy, or is it more like there might be problems that can be better solved by these sort of more online platforms, which probably are shallower, and kind of problems that are better tackled by this deeper face-to-face deliberation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair, I don't know, I guess challenge to what I was just saying a little bit earlier. I mean, I don't know. I guess we're also at a little bit of a stage of needing to prioritize where do we put in time and money and effort into developing the kind of digital infrastructure that's needed to be supporting deliberation in one way or another. And so I personally fall on the side of really thinking that we should be prioritizing the kinds of efforts to build the technology that's enabling better in-depth and in person if we can. But also, like I said, even the work that we're doing together with MIT, it's also applicable in a context of doing things virtually. Because I do think that there are certain contexts, for example, we're seeing more and more transnational and international deliberations that are taking place. There's been a number of citizens' assemblies that have happened at the EU level, taking place in 27 different languages with people from all across the EU. There was one attempt of something called the Global Assembly on Climate, which took place fully virtually, where there were people from all over the world that were part of it. And so I think for certain contexts, we do need to be developing the kind of technology that enables people to be deliberating in that fully virtual setting. But I think that is still a different philosophy to thinking about, like, let's try and set up one deliberation that includes, a million people on the same topic, which will always have its limitations. So I struggle to see in what context that would be more beneficial than having lots of smaller deliberations or creating the space for something that allows for more depth to take place. Because I think the trade-offs when it comes to the quality of deliberation, have always been related to the size of the group as well. Because even if you're trying to deliberate with 50 people, I don't know if you've ever done that. If you're in a group with 50 people trying to reach a shared set of consensus on anything with so many is already hard. So you're always the more you increase the size of a group, the more you end up then relying on aggregation of views and voting mechanisms rather than real deliberation that's attempting to get to a point of consensus. And within deliberative processes, there's often some form of voting that happens towards the end of it, but it's really kind of it's like a minimal aspect of the whole thing. And the more time and the more depth there is for it, both in small groups and a whole group to deliberate, the stronger the quality and the legitimacy, I think, of what comes out of it. So my vision of scaling is more in the sense of wanting to see deliberative assemblies happening in all sorts of kinds of institutions. So I mentioned also, and also at different levels of government. So I mentioned at the very start that the work we're doing at Democracy Next also involves work with other kinds of institutions like museums and universities and schools and workplaces. So thinking about how we can be introducing these kinds of practices into the decision making and the governance of other kinds of bodies, as well as I think there's no shortage of issues that would merit having a deliberative assembly established around them at local government levels, regional and national levels as well. And I have more of a vision of wanting to see many deliberative assemblies taking place more simultaneously on these different issues, rather than it being the case, which is the status quo today, or maybe there'll be like that one big assembly process once a year that takes place on a really important policy issue or piece of legislation or constitutional issues, like the example I mentioned in Ireland. I would love to see this become much more pervasive and something that becomes normal, which will require, I think, having much more supporting infrastructure to enable that being the case, which we don't have today. I think that's really the next wave and the next push of this becoming more normalized as well. But that to me is my vision of what does scaling mean in terms of wanting to scale the benefits of deliberation.
Just to answer to one your comment, I think even trying to deliberate with 5 people sometimes is really hard. So even 50 looks a very big number to me. I never tried, and I don't think I would succeed. But that means, of course, your team can bring a lot of skills on the table, bringing 50 people together and being able to deliberate about something. But I, as you mentioned, also want to allocate the time to create that bonding. And I'm really, really appreciated going to your broader answer and your vision about things. I think that's really important because I think scaling problem is often you can find it in statistical physics, but interestingly enough, I think you can also find it in the way we structure our societies. That usually scaling associates with sort of some level of fractal behaviors, and that's what we can see. So we usually tend to have. You can see that from the feudalism, more or less, and even before to now, we have some level of decision-making structure, and we tend to repeat them at different scales, but with some level of self-similarity. And I like your idea of having a similar approach when it comes to deliberation, that whatever is the scale of your deliberation, you want to kind of have a self-similar, replicable approach that makes it easier to everybody to implement, because you can, at that point, you kind of know it works. At whatever level you're deliberating on, if you're at, I don't know, United Nations level versus your local city council, the process is similar. It's just the stake maybe is different and the topic is different. I think that's a very interesting vision, which I personally buy a lot into. So we talked about scaling, and which I tend to think about space. And now I really like to dive into another topic. I know it's a topic that's also for you is very interesting, which is the topic of time. And I will start from an observation again, sort of reading some of your articles and listening to some of your other talks. Basically, I kind of see a dichotomy, which actually, personally, in my experience in implementation of technology is not really a dichotomy. And it comes with a quote or a saying that it goes like, slow down to speed up. And why I'm thinking of that when I'm reading some of your articles and some of the things you mentioned, because I think on the one hand, and you mentioned that, we need to allocate time to create this bonding, to create these deliberative spaces, actually deliberative space times, in the sense you need an element of a few days, and then they have to meet again after some time. So there is a process that needs to follow, and you can't rush it into a few seconds or a few minutes. So there is an element where you have to literally slow down to, as you said, sit with complexity and spend time with complexity. On the other hand, the final product, as far as I understand, is that it actually speeds up a lot compared to the current political decision making. It speeds up a lot our decision making capabilities. So maybe I'm completely wrong, but I really like to hear your point of view on this apparent contradiction that actually is probably one of the secrets of your approach. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point and nice observation, because I think you're right that there's something about this phrase of slowing down to speed up, which is very apt for talking about what deliberative assemblies enable. And actually, I loved the phrase, I just wrote it down, of deliberative space-time, and combining that actually as one concept in the way we actually think of space-time as inseparable things now. But anyways, that's another little tangent. But I think sometimes people have a resistance to deliberative assemblies because they're like, oh, well, that's going to take many months. And, it takes months to set one up, and they're going to deliberate for months. And so, this is urgent. But actually, how many urgent issues do we have where there's nothing happening because politically or for other incentivized reasons, nothing is actually happening, or there's no action being taken on really important issues? And what these deliberative spaces are doing are actually unblocking that potential for action by having a process that engenders the legitimacy to be able to then do something off the back of it. So I think there's many examples of this sort of thing. I opened up one of my old books, I think from I don't know if it was the one in 2015 or 2017, with the example of, from London, actually, I was living in London at the time where you're based now, related to all of the decisions and all of the various royal commissions and things that were set up about this question of should there be another airport established in London, like on the water or something like this. And there was at least £20 million spent on the various commissions and consultations and for years. And like, has there been a decision on this yet? Is this airport in existence? No, it is not. And you know, I'm not necessarily saying that a citizens assembly would have said like, yes, build it. But I think that having a better process in place much earlier on would have at least enabled like the question to be settled in a way that I think it's still kind of open and ongoing. And there's just been so much money wasted and a lot of time wasted. And that's just one example out of, you know, many that we could talk about in terms of the kinds of political decisions that, you know, I'm living in France where there's just been kind of decision after decision that was kind of pushed back also around pensions and pension reform. And well, in the end, I think there was some reform that was passed that resulted in a lot of protests though, and a lot of violence around that protest and things. So again, I think it just raises the question of how having better processes in place, perhaps around these particularly contentious issues, actually slow things down to enable them to speed up, as you were saying.
I like the example of London and the commissions and things. I can follow some of them sometimes, sort of the smaller scale, and I know what you mean. Still staying, I mean, expanding more on the concept of time. Another thing that I really find interesting, going back to the conversation around innovation and democracy, is the fact that democracy as a concept is relatively new, and we're treating it as very static. One book personally that really kind of changed my view about the whole process has been the Dawn of Everything. And I really liked it because we tend to hear, especially over the last few years, and I'm thinking even very famous writers like Harari, which kind of gives an element sort of inevitability of where we are now. And I think we tend to sit down a lot, especially in the Western world around, okay, that's the way we are structured is kind of inevitable. It's the way things are supposed to happen. And actually the Dawn of Everything showed that the innovation in the way we collectively work together and we collectively cooperate and deliberate is much messier than that. Thousands, millions of experiments happened at tribe level, at national level. Nations were created in some way and then disappeared. And all that things show that actually, in a way, nothing is inevitable, and that we can and we should be constantly trying to experiment and change the way we work together and we live together to improve. So why do you think we got in this place that we feel so static at the moment? It feels like that's the way and there is no other way.
I completely agree with you that I found that book really eye-opening and fascinating as well. I read it a while ago when it came out now, so I probably am fuzzier on some of the details of things. But one of the things that stuck with me after reading it was how in many societies, there was a kind of a shift within the same kind of year or within a period of time where people would sort of shift back and forth between different modes of governing themselves within the same community, between slightly more, I don't know if they use the term authoritarian, but maybe more like strong, like single leadership based forms of doing things and much more communitarian ways of doing things. And that the same group of people, depending on their circumstances of the time of year and for various reasons, would kind of adjust themselves back and forth between different ways of governing themselves. And to your point about having the sense of today things feel really static, I think that we're very far away from having any sense of that kind of back and forth between different ways or constantly shifting or evolving. I think for many people there's this sense of we've kind of historically maybe come to a culmination of what feels like, you know, the best or optimal or best sense of governing ourselves, and democracy being better than all other forms, you know, famous quotes being shared all the time about that. But I think Well, there's a few things. One is that in some ways, the concept of democracy is not actually all that new. What is newer is the equation of democracy with elections. So actually, if we go back to ancient Greece, there was the notion of democracy, but democracy was rather associated with both sortition, so random selection of decision makers, deliberation, and mass participation. So participation in assemblies where anybody could come and be part of them. So obviously there's all the caveats about who they meant by anybody and who was considered a citizen, and slaves and so on were not part of that. So, not going into the down the rabbit hole of talking about those things, because I think in all moments of history anyways, we've never had a society where actually absolutely everybody is empowered. Even today, I live in France as a Canadian and Polish citizen, and I can't vote here. So immigrants are still not empowered in many ways. So a side note to the side about the fact that we've always had forms of exclusion in our systems that have varied over time. What has been really interesting when you sort of dive into the history of democracy is that, we've had elections also over many periods of time and in different forms and in different ways as well. But elections, until much more recently in history, were considered a form of oligarchy, meaning quite literally just rule by the pew. And it's only in the past around 200 years that this notion of elections has come to be associated with democracy, as there have been the movements that were with suffragettes trying to expand suffrage to more and more people. If you go back even to some of the key texts and moments in history around the French and American revolutions, for example, the word democracy doesn't even appear anywhere, because the intention was not to actually set up a system that was considered democratic. So I think it's an interesting moment in time that we're in now, though, because I think there's nonetheless a bit of a challenge to and a questioning about democracy. And we see it with the rise of populist and authoritarian and nativist. We can call them different terms depending what people are talking about in particular, but of different kinds of movements that are sort of questioning not only certain policies that are important today, but really questioning the premise of our systems of governance and threatening them, I think, in certain ways. But I think coming from a legitimate set of concerns that we are not in an optimal system of governing ourselves, and that we are in a system where there is a lot of power amongst few people, and elections are not a system that are designed to be democratic, and even the institutions of political parties are themselves oligarchic institutions. And there's many more contemporary philosophers and theorists who have written about this as well. I was just reading the other day, or rereading parts of On Revolution by Hannah Arendt, and she also talks about this at length in that work. And so I think I don't know. I personally fall on the side of needing to be open to rethinking and kind of challenging some of our assumptions that we have. I think that there's, amongst many people, a commitment to the values that are behind democracy. And part of the problem is that our existing systems of governance and decision making are not truly enabling us to live out those democratic values. And so there is a need to be innovating. What does democracy mean for us today? And I think even I've been thinking a lot about it relates to the vocabulary and the language we're even using. And if we want to be going towards another system that isn't as centered around elections, do we actually need another terminology for that? Do we need to call it something else? And I don't know what, but this is part of some of the things that I'm exploring at the moment.
The role of language over the last few years has become personally weird in some way, in the sense that while it is very powerful, maybe sometimes we spend too much time talking about words and not about the actual substance behind those words, giving to language maybe too much power. But I understand your perspective. While in this specific case, it's probably the other way around. It's like we are maybe by calling things with certain names, it kind of make them slower. Going towards the end, I'd like to take another look at what you just discussed and possibly also touching into an author that I know we are very fond of, which is Rosa. And I'm really thinking about maybe another reason because it feels static is also because maybe it's actually going through a natural pace of evolution, but there is an acceleration going on everywhere else. And that's why it basically is more that it's not static, but it's moving so slow and it's not being able to keep things up. Is it another way to look at that?
It's a good point, actually. And Hartmut Rosa, I know we've had some conversations about this in the past, and I really find his work incredibly compelling. So one of the main things that he's known for is the kind of theorizing and the work that he's done around this concept of social acceleration, making the case that there's a sort of like a kind of discrepancy or divide between what is sort of, I guess, maybe a natural pace of things and of life and of things evolving, and the pace at which things have come to become normal today with social media and the ways in which we're kind of interacting and doing things, and that in a way, this divide between, what is actually a more natural pace of life and then the pace at which things have come to become normal is a part of why so many people today have this feeling of alienation, and which is linked up to a sense of lack of belonging and loneliness, and again those much deeper root problems that we have with democracy. I think we talk a lot about the symptoms of the problems in terms of lack of turnout and people are voting for these parties, etc. But actually, the deep roots of the problems are rooted rather in these deeper feelings that people have and are experiencing. And in terms of kind of what is part of a solution to this, his latest work has been on this concept of resonance and wanting to create intentionality about seeking resonance in our relationships and our interactions with people. And I guess if you take that word, there's when you say to someone, that resonates, it kind of speaks to what this idea means of creating the opportunities where people actually have much more deeper and meaningful connection with one another. So that, again, you can only have meaningful connection with so many people. And to have that, it also takes time. So it goes back again to a lot of the themes we've been sort of weaving in and out throughout this thing. But I think we're really at a moment where we need to be thinking so intentionally about how we spend our time, how we design our spaces and structures and processes for being with one another. And a lot of it is just so much at odds with the pace of social media, the election cycles, also the timelines of them and so on. How do we actually intentionally create this deliberative space-time? I'm going to bring back your phrase there. So yeah, I don't know. I guess that's again a bit of a meandering set of thoughts, but this is why I find his work so compelling in particular.
I like actually the way it came back to the beginning. I think probably goes naturally to the conclusion of this interview, even if I would have many more questions. But anyway, it might be for another time. So I like to close with the question that I ask all my guests. And I think this is going to be very interesting, also considering, again, your background and all the experience you had around, of course, decision making. And so what are the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity?
Yeah, so that's a nice way to close. I think it ties a lot of these threads together. I mean, I suppose a leader who embraces complexity, has to be a leader who also embraces uncertainty and being with emergence and the agility and the adaptability that requires in an ongoing way, and the humility that requires, as well as sometimes being able to say, I don't know, or, this is what I need to do to better actually have a response to this question, or needing to be able to be open to changing one's mind based on new things or new evidence or new ideas that are kind of put forward. And I think related to that is a real need to be able to be attuned to context, and adapting to different kinds of contexts. And the same solution is not something that will be the same everywhere. So if you're really embracing complexity, you're embracing all of those things as well.
Great way to sum this conversation up. So thanks a lot again for being here. That was very interesting and was a really pleasure to have this discussion with you today.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Christian. I enjoyed this as well. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Engines of Creation, diving into the future of democracy and governance. Claudia Chwalisz's insights challenge us to rethink our current systems and embrace innovative approaches to decision-making, pushing us to create a more inclusive and effective democratic process. If you want to learn more, be sure to follow Engines of Creation and leave us a rating and review. And don't hesitate to share this episode on social media and with friends and colleagues who might be interested. This podcast counts on you to grow and help other people to understand and embrace complexity to innovate and create. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to reach out to enginesofcreation@masterdonato.co. See you for the next episode.